Let's now take a look through the international newspapers with Elena Casas. Hello, Elena. So what are they making then of that second bailout for Greece?
Well, remember the French papers this morning had a lot to say about the timing of the bailout. Are the EU, by negotiating this, effectively just buying time? Now, the editorial of Greek paper Kathimerini is headlined "Running Out of Time." They're not talking quite so much about time for the EU to prepare for a default as the French papers were. They want time for Greek politicians to wake up and realise the scale of the challenge that they're facing and come up with some policies that are really capable of dealing with the situation that Greece is in. They say that so far they're just behaving like a bunch of kids in a school playground. They're trying to defend their own interests, the different Greek political parties, without seeing the big picture. That's effectively what they're also saying in the Spanish paper El País. Now, Spain, of course, isn't, also very vulnerable to these kinds of economic problems, and El País is looking at it from the left. There's an element of there, but for the grace of God, go us to this article. But they're talking about the divisions appearing within Greece and within Greek politics, especially over this bailout. Of course, there's an election coming up in Greece fairly soon, in April, I think, which we shouldn't forget. And they say that while the two main parties, PASOK, Socialists and New Democracy, have both signed up to a pledge saying they'll agree to the IMF's budget cuts that have been imposed, they say more and more Greeks are turning to more marginal parties on both the left and the right that want a default, that are actively suggesting this would be the best policy, and that have campaigning effectively on the ticket of the bailout being an undemocratic imposition on Greece.
Did the papers think then that this was enough to avoid default for Greece?
Well, the New York Times says that any hope of staving off default is illusory. They say that creditors really, again, are just buying themselves time. The markets are totally short-sighted. As Owen's been saying all morning, they're actually doing quite high despite the kind of obvious financial hole that the papers and commentators all say that there still is in Greece. Now, the New York Times says that's just completely short-sighted because it's obvious that that hole is going to be filled with something, and the collapse can only be delayed for so long, effectively. The Guardian is making the same point from a rather more left-wing point of view there. They say the €130 billion plaster is basically stripped Greece of any kind of sovereignty. They say it's now independent, own name only, now that its money is going to be kept in a blocked account that it will have to behave well in order to get hold of, and there's going to be permanent IMF inspectors installed in Greece. They say that effectively this is the end of Greek democracy.
Moving on now to Somalia, the paper's also looking at that.
Yeah, this is the Guardian's front page. There's a big international conference about Somalia tomorrow in London, and the front page announces that the UK apparently is weighing up the idea of strikes against Somali rebels. Now, this is apparently because there are now more training camps, according to that paper, for jihadists who come there from all over the world in Somalia than there are in Afghanistan. And these kind of training camps could be plotting intelligence plots against the West. And in an attempt to crack down on them, apparently there's a secret military plan that the UK is drawing up, which involves hitting them with heavily armed helicopters that would fly off of ships off the coast of Somalia. Now, there's an interesting article in here, a profile of a man who's a British citizen, that man there, Jermaine Grant, who is originally from North London, but apparently was trained in a Somali training camp and is currently on trial in Kenya for supposedly plotting a terror plot that was meant to take place there. And so he could, if the British intelligence can get hold of him, the paper says, be a useful source to find out what exactly is being planned in Somalia.
And also making headlines is the release of the Palestinian hunger striker.
Yes, just briefly, this is Khaled Adnan, a man who became a hero to the Arab world when he was detained, he says, arbitrarily by the Israelis. He is known to be an activist for Islamic Jihad, which is a fairly hardline group, but the Israelis hadn't actually charged him with any offence, and he had been jailed for 66 days, and he'd been on a hunger strike. He'd become a hero to the Arab world. They've now decided to let him go, but for the right-wing Jerusalem Post, this is just evidence for them that he's blackmailed the Israeli state, effectively, by doing something as dramatic as a hunger strike.
All right, thank you very much, Elena, for that look at the international papers.